Hi, I'm going to give a recap of some of the ideas that we've been playing around with and introducing over the past several months. It's been a long several months. It's been an entire spring and summer. We've had Neuromatch, two Neuromatch conferences in the Neuromatch Academy, and our Saturday morning NeuroSim group has been going weekly throughout that time. And so I wanted to give a recap of some of the ideas that have sprung from all of these interactions. They're going to be two areas I'm going to see. So, I'm going to sort of explore two of these ideas that came up during this time, and then hopefully when you view this, it will foster some future discussion. So these are ideas that were featured during our meetings or as a part of Neuromatch from May to August. The first idea is something that I created a information theory talk during Neuromatch because I didn't think that they covered information theory at a high enough level in Neuromatch. And so I came up with this lecture. It's on the website. It's also in the videos in one of the Saturday morning meetings. And I know that some of our people at our meetings, Jesse and Hansen in particular, are interested in Gibsonian, J.J. Gibson's notion of cognition. And so J.J. Gibson was this gentleman here who came up with the idea of ecological perception or direct perception. And he had a number of ideas that sprang from that point of view. One of them is this idea of Gibsonian information. And I don't know, if you Google it, you probably won't find much on it, but it's something that we kind of thought about when we were thinking about Gibson, thinking about information theory. And so this is Gibson, and his whole hypothesis was that information, unlike Shannon information, which you'll see in a minute how that works, information comes from motion. If something moves in the environment, you perceive that movement, and that's information. If something moves against a backdrop, you can see that information as opposed to something that's static, where there's no information. And so this is information inherent in direct perception. So motion provides information. And this could be optical flow. This could be the relative motion between an object and an observer. Or this could be structure that arises from motion. I don't have a slide on it here, but there have been these experiments in psychology where they would take a human being in a mocap suit. So they like dress them in a black suit and they put them on a black background. And they put markers, reflective markers, on their joints. And then they have them walk like in place so that the joints are moving like they would move during movement. And you see, as an observer, you see all these dots in the shape of a human and they're moving. And they've done this in experiments where they've presented this to people. And they presented this against some controls and in some null cases where there's just random lights or no light at all, or someone moving without the markers. And people are able to identify the human motion of these markers. There's no other information other than the markers moving around, but they can infer a person walking. And so this is the kind of information that you get. And this is what we're calling Gibsonian information. Now we can oppose this, of course, to Shannon information, which is where variety provides information. And this is a little bit of an odd, maybe interpretation of Shannon information, but not so much. Here you see an example. You have a bunch of pictures of Shannon. Some of them are in sepia, and some of them are in black and white. And from that distribution in that array, you can derive a proportion of images that are sepia, and then count that as if you resample this a bunch of times and change the number of images that are sepia, then you can get an ensemble and derive its information. But the idea is that, in this case, variety is information. More specifically, probabilities are information. So there's a probability of one state occurring amongst a set of states. And you can figure that out over an ensemble of samples. And so this gives us this notion of structure versus randomness. So in other words, if things are predict if things are deterministic, there's not very much information. If things are random, there isn't very much information. But there has to be some structure to this variation, and that gives us a high information content. So I mean that's we have the information theory talk, and I get into that a little bit more in depth. And there's some of that's debatable. But what I want to do now is I want to go and look at the differences between Gibsonian information and Shannon information. So as I'm proposing it, Gibsonian information, the attributes of this are flow, so it's optical flow or movement, or contrast. So I told you about the experiment with the people in the motion capture suits. That's contrast against a background. If you see things that emerge against a background in a different color, or in a different, if there's a light source, or if something is moving against that background. That's all information that we can extract out of the scene. As opposed to Shannon information, which is, people have characterized it alternately as surprise, heterogeneity, and diversity. And so again, this goes back to this idea of things, if there's a lot of variety, there's a lot of information. But of course, that depends on your point of view. If you're looking at something that's completely random, there isn't a lot of information in that. There's information in something that's a little bit more structured, but equally as heterogeneous. Surprise, of course, being something that we covered in the talk, in the information theory talk, where if you're looking for a certain state, its relative rarity is the surprise factor. So you're surprised to find something in a distribution. It's almost like it's an out of distribution object, or an out of distribution state that you stumble upon in your sampling. And so there's a surprise, there's a high information value to that. So those are, there actually may be some similarities as well as some contrasts with those types of information. And so I have to stress that Gibsonian information isn't really, there's no quantitative framework for that as opposed to Shannon information. This is maybe something we can propose later in the form of a paper or in the form of some sort of presentation. But as of right now, Gibsonian information is not quantitative. It's basically some qualitative observations. That being said, though, I think Gibsonian information, we can characterize it largely as the product of disjoint distributions. And so disjoint distributions are, say, the difference between moving pixels and stationary pixels over time. We are not really looking at the joint distribution as we are in Shannon information, which is the mutual information between pixels of different states, but rather the difference or disjoint distribution between static parts of an image and moving parts of an image. So where that contrast occurs is where there's sort of maximal Gibsonian information. Also, we know that Gibsonian information is temporally dependent, just by virtue of it being associated with motion. If we look at an image and we see motion, if we're sitting in a car and we're driving away from somewhere and we look at that place and that place gets progressively smaller in our field of view, we know that there's something about, there's some cue there, there's some motion cue that can tell us about distance. A naive view might think that that object is getting smaller in a static sense. If we just took a slice of static images and put them together, we might say, well, that object's getting smaller. But of course, we know from other motion cues that that's actually not the case, that we're actually getting farther away from the object, and that there's this information in the image that can tell us this. If you've ever looked at a three-dimensional image where people, of course, when people draw three-dimensional images, they draw like things in the foreground, things in the background, and they usually join them with lines. And, this is like in a cartoon or in like a geometric diagram to show the depth. So there are lines that join the foreground and background to show the depth. And in fact, there are some visual illusions, like the Kanaiza illusion, where you have these foreground and background are sort of superimposed upon one another with no cues as to the depth. And so if you look at it very casually, you think, well, these things, there's no depth, and so they're overlapping. And then, you think about, you look at it a little bit longer and you think about it and you say, okay, there's depth there. I see the depth now. But that information, it could be inherent in the image, but it may not be inherent in the image. And so there is something there. There's some disjoint distribution we need to uncover. But the Gibsonian information is temporally dependent. That means we can characterize it as a time series. And as such, there are a whole bunch of tools that opens us up to in terms of time series analysis. There are all sorts of regression techniques as well as signal processing techniques that we might use on this. And people have studied visual flow in the area of robotics for many years, so there are a lot of potential tools out there we can look at. As opposed to Shannon information, which is based on the concept of an IID, or an independently distributed distribution. So this is a probability distribution, but each point is assumed to be sampled independently of time and independently of space. I should note that Gibsonian information also has a spatial component, so it's spatially dependent. And if it's temporally and spatially dependent, we can even use things like two-dimensional wavelets to analyze it. So Shannon information doesn't have those assumptions, but it does have this IID assumption where every sample is independent and it's a probability of some independent process that generates it. So those are sort of the high-level concepts. Maybe we can propose some metrics here. And so for the Shannon side, we have some observations that exist as a quantitative thing, but in the Gibsonian side, we have some things that are potentially quantitative parameters and concepts. So for Shannon information, we have maximum entropy. And maximum entropy is, of course, if you take any ensemble, you can calculate the maximum amount of entropy there is in the ensemble. And given no other assumptions, that's usually Hmax. Now, in the Gibsonian counterpart might be something like maximum coherent movement. I'm kind of struggling to figure out how to characterize Gibsonian information, so this might not be the best way to do it. But maybe one possibility is this maximum coherent movement. In other words, what's the maximum amount of movement you can have without breaking up your image into this randomized, flurry of things that you can't interpret or there's no information in it. So if you look at like white noise, static on a television, on an analog television, you'll see that there's this static and there's no information inherent in the static. It's just a Gaussian process that's going on. All right, so there's no information in that. But if you had a bunch of blocks, like maybe a cellular automata or something like that, where you have blocks that are changing their state and they're flashing, and it's kind of like a downsampled white noise in a way, but except that we know that in cellular automata we have this we have these rules underlying these cells changing color, and so there is structure there, and there's motion, and there's some coherence to it. So that's maybe what we mean by maximum coherent movement. On the flip side of that, you have minimum entropy, so you can calculate the minimum entropy you can have in a Shannon ensemble, and that's of course as opposed to maximum entropy, and you can set those bounds in an analysis of any ensemble. Now for the Gibsonian counterpart would be minimum coherent movement, so it follows the same logic as the Shannon case, where we now calculate the minimum coherent movement. So in that case, it would be, what's the minimum thing that needs to emerge out of a static background? That would give us information cues. It might be one pixel that flashes on and off. It might be something that moves just a little bit or maybe a lot. One pixel moving across a background, and you can detect that. Now, there's a lot of psychophysics you can apply to this as well. There's this concept of like the Weber-Fechner law, where you're able to detect small amounts of change, and it's quantitative. So you present someone with like 100 dots versus 105 dots, and people aren't going to you do this very quickly, so people can't count the number of dots, but you flash them on a screen and you say, did you detect a difference between those two arrays? And of course they're different, but by a very small amount. And so that's maybe one way we can characterize as minimum coherent movement. And then finally, for Shannon information, we have channel capacity. So channel capacity is this idea that every channel of information has a finite capacity to it. That's how we can measure Hmax and Hmin, because each channel has a certain capacity. It might be the number of bits or the number of states that are represented in it. It might be the flow. So, I mean, you could calculate Shannon information as flow. But there's a capacity, upper bound of capacity, of course, and maybe even a lower bound of capacity. And so in Gibsonian information, there's, of course, likewise a capacity. It could be flow rate. So it could be how much are things moving around your image or your background. And this, of course, relates to our measures. So there's an upper bound and a lower bound to that. And so now we know kind of what the capacity is. And this capacity wouldn't be inherent to the stimulus. It's more inherent to this perceptual system. And when Shannon information gets applied to the perceptual system, we can characterize channel capacity and things like working memory. And so there are some problems with that kind of analysis too. What do you define as a state or as a bit? Well, we may have the same problem with Gibsonian information, but we can consider it maybe as flow rate capacity for now and think about maybe, the implications of that. So Gibsonian information is about extracting information directly from the environment. So it's direct perception. And again, the Gibsonian information falls in the same spirit. We have this same concern with capacity, but in different ways. For Shannon information, it's channel capacity. For Gibsonian information, it's flow rate, but there's a capacity there. Now, this is something that is maybe a step ahead of where we are here. I was thinking about like how we can go a little bit farther into ecological psychology or ecological perception to understand things in our perceptual system or in maybe an artificial system. And I found this paper, Ecological Approach to Navigation, a Gibsonian Perspective. And I like this paper because it dovetails with something that we were doing earlier this summer. Actually, last spring and summer, but who knows anymore. This is this abstract that Jesse and I wrote on the perspectives on and for diverse computational societies. And this was submitted to Collective Intelligence 2020, and it was promptly rejected. And it was as a extended abstract. And the problem was, of course, this concept was so difficult to communicate that it was just not made for that type of venue. So, but we still have all of this stuff here. We have this diagram that shows these shapes, and they're being transformed in some way. And they're being transformed to these networks on the side here, C and D. So A and B are different types of transformations of a triangle. And let's look at what that means at the bottom of the screen. So what these are basically what we call anamorphic transformations. And so in A, we're using an affine or an affinity criterion to rotate them and reshape them. In B, we're using a deformation. So we're using a geometric deformation. So you can see in the affine case, you have a triangle and you're basically shifting in different orientations. With the deformation, though, we're actually changing the sides of the triangle so that you have these curves instead of squared edges. And so these are dealt with perceptually, especially in terms of optical flow. So at the left, we talk about optical flow of this perspective structure is generated. And the idea behind the abstract was that we had this idea that we could create these agents that had different networks, and these are genotype to phenotype mappings that would generate like some response in the phenotype, and depending on what they saw in these arrays. And the idea was that if you transform the shapes, some of them might be specialized for certain types of transformation, and others would be specialized for other types of transformation. And then we could look at these topologies and learn something about maybe how they're processing these types of transformations. So in this construction of cognitive maps paper, the psychological approach to navigation, they're doing this, they're taking the optical flow of their visual perspective, so they might look at like a path, and they might walk down a path, and they're generating the structure based on their optical flow of that viewpoint. And then the perceiver moves along that path. But then let's suppose that they shift their perspective so that they're walking backwards. Okay? And then they follow this path, and they're following the cues. Maybe they look at the ground below them and they say, okay, this road is continuing. Let's go backwards along this road, and let's view the road from sort of a retrospective view. All right, so that's a different viewpoint, 180-degree shift. So you're shifting like an A, you're doing an affine transformation of the viewpoint. Now you have different flow information. So, and you also don't know if you're going to run off a cliff or something. That's the problem. That's a detriment to fitness, I guess. But anyways, you have these two different views. And so you're going to maybe observe two different behaviors. Maybe in terms of how the person walks on the path, maybe in terms of the sampling strategy. But there are different strategies that are involved in this type of, depending on the optical flow, depending on the Gibsonian information that is available, the path will be traveled in a certain way. And so with these agents, you see maybe a similar thing. We didn't really implement this, but you'll see a similar thing, we predict. You'll see these transformations, some of these topologies, C and D, this is what they maybe correspond to, but there should be differences between them. And so, I mean, that's something we can explore more. I just thought that was a nice connection between all of this. The second topic I want to talk about, and this is something I know that Hansen is interested in, probably Jesse as well, probably some other people. I presented this talk on virtuality at the second Neuromatch conference. And so Neuromatch is, it was something that we created during the pandemic. It was like 2 conferences, 2 months in a row, and then there was a summer school that they held, and I was a mentor for it, and a lot of the students in our group were in it. And this is for future reference in case you're watching this, you don't know what Neuromatch is. But this was at the second Neuromatch conference. This was in May of 2020. So I presented this paper on virtuality. It was a talk, really. And one of the contentions I made in the virtuality talk, aside from virtual environments being special for cognition, was that the brain is an allostasis machine that differentiates. And you see here, the brain is an allostasis machine. Okay. Well, what is allostasis? Maybe that's where we can start. Allostasis is where you have there's this thing called homeostasis. So your brain and your body exist in the state of homeostasis, right? You have a set point for different things. You have a set point for body temperature because you're homeothermic. If you go out in the sun, if you go out in the cold, your body might chill or heat up, but you always return to that temperature, unless you have a fever. But, you'll return mainly to that temperature. The body has this regulatory system that's, complex enough to let it, go back to that set point. Now, this has been applied to stress research, And this review here tells you a little bit about that application. So people have looked at stress in this way. They call it a generalized physiologic response. And so your physiological response also has a set point. The set point being maybe like a state of arousal or a state of stress. And so you can experience great arousal or great stress and then return back to normal when things cool down. Or, conversely, you can go to sleep and sleep very hard and deep all night and then get up and you can become, re-aroused and ready to go for the day. I mean, we don't think about it that way, but that's basically what happens when you go to sleep. You shut down your system and then you boot back and then but you don't just, go all over the place unless there's something wrong with you physically. You usually hit this sort of set point for stress, for arousal, whatever. And the idea is that the brain actually does this, maybe not just for arousal and stress, but for other cognitive functions as well. And so the argument I was making there was that we can maybe modify this set point, or we can figure out, maybe some of the ways in which people lack the ability to adapt back to that set point. And virtual environments are important in that because virtual environments provide us with stimuli that we never otherwise experience. So we can experience weightlessness in a virtual environment, or we're mapping our movements to some computerized stimulus that gives us maybe some haptic feedback, but it's, there is a gap there. And we don't really know, our body doesn't necessarily understand that, our physiological machinery. And so, as you can see down at the bottom of the screen, you have all these different varied responses maybe to some, we can call it a stressor because it's, something that you're having to struggle to understand physiologically and cognitively. And so you can deliver it in different patterns of presentation. So you can think about them as hits, you can do repeated hits, you can do repeated hits, and then if your physiology lacks the ability to respond adaptively, you lose track of your internal state and it drifts off. Now, these are all different possible responses your body can make. So this will become clearer in a couple slides, but this is the allostasis machine idea, and it's it's sort of built upon homeostasis. We talk about homeostasis, as this thing, that adaptive systems do, and it's mysterious, but it really isn't suitable for, say, a very dynamic system. If you want that, you have to really think about allostasis because your set point is there, but your environmental conditions are constantly changing. And indeed, your stress point or your set point can change along with that because, as you know, your body exhibits plasticity, or maybe doesn't exhibit plasticity, but those all have that sort of, hyperdynamic background has an effect on that. So Peter Sterling was the person who sort of brought this idea to physiology. He was a medical researcher, physiologist, and he kind of was, he's written a lot of stuff. So I would check out Peter Sterling if you want to know more about this. But in this concept, allostasis machines, we can think of it in a couple ways. First of all, we can think of allostasis as dynamics. So what shifts systems to a homeostatic state? Okay, what are the set points? And we can think about that in a number of ways. We can think about maybe our set points or our background as being, we can model it using something like anomalous diffusion. So we can model diffusion as some random process that drifts from, from a stable state or a stable point and does it in different ways. You can generate different types of diffusion using statistical distributions, and you can model it that way. So that might have some, we can understand it that way. Or we can understand it as in terms of phase transitions or differences between phases. And so this allows us to look at things like hysteretic allostatic load, which is a shift in the set point, or a recoverable allostatic load, which is a recovery to the original set point. So we can think of the set points as different phases, and then a phase transition between the two. And so we can understand it that way as well. But we can also understand allostatic drive as differentiation. And so differentiation, I talk about this in the mathematical sense, but maybe also in the physiological or biological sense. We can build a tree representation of different states, physiological states. And so, as opposed to like the phase transition model, we can actually model this as like a bifurcating process where you have these homeostatic states that maybe when they're put under stress, they break off into two different states or two different set points, stable set points. So think about it like if your body temperature was like 98.6 and you started experiencing very, hot conditions or very cold conditions, then your body temperature, and this wouldn't happen in real life, but let's just suppose your body temperature set point might bifurcate to a very hot set point and a very cold set point. To be this might happen in evolution now, but I don't know of any examples of it, but this is the idea I'm talking about. It's just like where you have one set point that bifurcates into two. You can also have external switches, so you can have things that the environment can switch a lot, and that switching of the environment can trigger new and maybe different set points. So these internal models of the state of the organism are sort of modified, or you're exploring the state with these external stimuli. So we took this concept of switches and we can explore it further, and we can use this. There's a type of learning. There's a learning paradigm called learn, unlearn, and relearn. And so, maybe this is an induction of allostatic drive. So allostatic drive, again, is this idea that you can move the set point, or you can challenge the system with stress, and you can see if the system adapts or not. It either adapts to the old set point or adapts to a new set point, or fails to adapt. And so we can explore this with this sort of external switching. And this is sort of one of the experiments that I ran at least 10 years ago now. This is where someone's doing some physical activity and they're in a virtual environment, and this stimulus is made so that there's a switching of weights, so the weight is variable. And the idea is that the environment changes rapidly with respect to the activity. And so you're actually able, in the case where you don't have the distortion, you can learn the task, right? And then when you have the distortion, you unlearn the task. There's some interference. And then you relearn the task and you see if, maybe you adapt to the interference, or you remove the interference and you relearn the task. And maybe I'm confusing it a little bit here, but it allows you to sort of look at how people deal with these kind of stresses, and if they can respond to their learning curve responds in a way that's overcomes this. So these are the kind of results we get. And again, the results are not very clear. There's obvious, in some cases, there's an advantage for not making the intervention. In some cases, there's an advantage for the intervention. The data is very unclear here, but and then we can do the same thing with people interacting with surfaces instead of some sort of motion, some sort of physical activity. We're actually letting them explore different types of surfaces where they are exploring different surfaces. They're kind of learning them. The idea being that if it's the same surface, every time these trajectories would get tighter and tighter, and they wouldn't really explore very much, or they'd have a systematic way of exploring it. In this case, we see that that's not true at all, that there's a lot of variation in the exploration pattern. Some of these surfaces might be similar enough so that that they're basically using the same strategy to explore, but this is not always the case. Again, this is not a very clear result. So this idea isn't really I wouldn't say it's not something that, exists. It's just that the data are very hard to interpret. So, this point about the physics of the environment. So you have forces, you have light, you have surfaces. These all act to supervise the nervous system. So in terms of plasticity and learning. So these attributes of the environment that you're modifying, they actually supervise the nervous system. When the nervous system hasn't really seen anything like this before, or maybe not in the normal course of doing this activity, then it has to be supervised by these new attributes of the physical environment. And so the stimulus switching allows us to explore how we can maybe unmoor a lot of our typical motor behaviors and things like that with these new forces and other types of physics, and to see where how the physiological system responds to that. But then we can go down to another level and ask the question, how does a network of neurons respond to a stressor? So this is a different take on allostasis machines, and this might require simulations, as does maybe the behavioral aspect of it, which is maybe the better way to go, at least to begin with, because then we can at least control things a little bit better. So the stressor can increase or decrease the sensitivity of each cell so that the load propagates across the cell array in different ways. And so this is the idea that, if you stress one part of the nervous system, it'll spread, or we can use something like a nerve net that you find in jellyfish and hydra, where there's some sort of stress that propagates across the network. And, we can examine that spread based on properties of the neurons and their resistance to change or their ability to return to their set point. I wish I had a figure for this, but I don't. So, finally, I wanted to get to Hansen's. So Hansen, several weeks ago, at the beginning of the summer, actually, produced all these diagrams, and it's really impressive. And he came up with this. He has these. He's interested in allostasis, but he's also interested in dichotomies, and he's interested in allostasis from a behavioral perspective. So, the physiological case might not be something he's interested in as much, but he was talking here about possible dichotomies between different emotional states and, mental states. And so I thought this was really interesting. These are, I guess, processing states. And they developed these things called stackings, which I find really interesting. We'll have to explore this in the future. But I guess this idea comes out of enactivism and embodiment. So, I thought about it. It was really interesting. It's chronological activation. So, but I actually had some analogous ideas about representing things in the environment. So, these are CGS models that we work with in the lab. This is how you map a color space to a circle. And so the idea is that we have these things in the environment that we have to sort of create a representation for. And the idea is to create these geometric representations that encode different aspects of these stimuli in different ways. And, they're sort of fuzzy classifications that allow for different, membership functions. So a stimulus can belong to multiple different categories at a different degree. And it's really, it tries to be flexible in the representation. It also tries to be rich in the representation. So thinking about what Hansen drew, I had come up with this before his session where he presented this, but I kind of pulled them out, and I was looking at some of the stuff that we had here. So this is a CMYK representation, or a 32-bit representation of a color space. So this is a way of representing color using CMYK. And so we can use this type of representation. In this representation, we have the diameter of the So this thing is a circle, and these quadrants are these different components of the color channel. And the diameter, which is d, is the depth of the point based on its presence or relative presence or absence. So if it's at the middle, it's not there at all. If it's a 1, it's out on the edge, and it's, the maximal value, which means the thing is either fully C or fully M, and not anywhere else in the representation. And then this membership function is measured in radians. So then membership function then is some, angle within this region. So if it's M, it's at some angle, and that's the membership function. And these two parameters are correlated. And so this is one way we can build a color representation. We can do this for just a standard representation set up this way, or we can change the representation around so that we can look at things like intervals. We can look at, if you want to represent it all as one thing instead of a quadrant system, we can do that as well, and it changes the character of the representation. Not sure if we're going here. In any case, I think this is pretty much all I wanted to cover in this session. I would say that the representations, I think, are something we should follow up on. We've been working on these CGS models as a way to look at a rich representation, and then connecting it to something like a Bradenberg vehicle or some sort of low representation thing or like a deep neural network or a neural network that doesn't really have a representation to it, but does a lot of processing of data. And we can connect these to that sort of model to sort of represent higher level concepts and plug them in. So we just presented a paper at the Artificial Life Conference on the confluence of sort of Bradenberg vehicle networks within the Bradenberg vehicles, which have a sort of a rudimentary neural network, and then these CGS models, which are high level representations of things like color and maybe even emotional states. People have said that Bradenberg vehicles have emotional states, but those are very limited in terms of their scope. People say that there's love and that there's other types of, fear, other types of behaviors that are represented with them, but that's not really, they just kind of they avoid maybe a light source, or they, are attracted to a light source. That's not really that behavior. It sort of resembles a behavior, but with this kind of a setup, with the higher level representation, maybe we can say more, we can produce a more intentional behavior. So, that's something that we can follow up on again. And we don't have to use this model for the high levels of representation. But I think something like what Hansen showed might be good for for representing certain behavioral states. And then, you can have an agent that switches between behavioral states or emotional states. And they can represent things based on fluctuations in the environment. Or conversely, they can keep that emotional state despite a lot of fluctuations in the environment. And then we'll have something that's a lot more intelligent than normal that we'd otherwise would have. Because, we're, when we operate on simple models like Bradenberg vehicles or neural networks or whatever, you're kind of producing things that look like good behaviors, but they're qualitative representations. They're not really intentional behaviors. And so this might cover that gap. I think that's the end of the presentation. Indeed. So thanks for joining me on this. If you have any ideas or questions, you can attend one of our Saturday morning NeuroSim meetings, or you can email me or Jesse or Hansen or any of the other people in the group if you know them, and you can provide some feedback. This is, again, just a recap of our spring and summer activities and sort of the ideas that we want to maybe explore further. And thank you.